My name is Margaret Collins, and I spent 20 years paying the mortgage on a house that wasn't even mine. The truth didn't come to me in some dramatic courtroom or confession. It came in a county office under fluorescent lights that buzzed louder than my thoughts when a young clerk looked at me and said, "Ma'am, this deed isn't under your name." She tilted the monitor toward me, and there it was in black and white. Mrs. Franklin Collins, Cheryl Collins. For a second, I couldn't move. I'd spent half my life cooking dinners I couldn't taste, clipping coupons, staying late at work to make sure every mortgage payment cleared. And now, the house I believed was my safety had someone else's name on it. That's where it started. Frank and I bought the house in Bloomington, Indiana back in 2003. It wasn't fancy 2 stories, faded white siding, and a porch that leaned slightly when the wind came through, but I loved it. I called it our forever place. We signed the papers together, but from that day forward, every check, every receipt, every cent came from me. Frank was a traveling salesman, the kind of man who could make strangers laugh in a grocery line, but forget his own anniversary. He always said, "You're better with money, Maggie. You handle the bills." And I did. Every month I paid that mortgage like clockwork. 20 years of envelope stamps and little notes to myself. Paid in full. Almost there. Just 2 more years. By the time we reached our 20th anniversary, I thought we'd made it. The mortgage statement said only 1 payment remained. I told Frank we should celebrate maybe a small dinner at the Bluebird Cafe. He kissed my cheek and said, "Let me handle the final paperwork, sweetheart. You've done enough." That night I slept easy for the first time in years. A few weeks later, the letter came from the Monroe County Recorder's Office confirming the transfer of title. I tucked it into my purse, planning to check it in person on my lunch break. The clerk was young, probably no older than my daughter would have been if we'd had one. She smiled politely, typed my name into her computer, and then stopped. The kind of stop that fills a room with something invisible. "Could you spell that again, ma'am?" she asked. I did. Twice. Then she turned the screen toward me. Cheryl M. Collins. I felt a chill even though the air conditioning wasn't on. I laughed a dry, awkward sound. That's got to be a mistake. "I'm Mrs. Collins." She looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, but the deed was transferred 3 months ago. Looks like a refinance under a new title." 3 months ago? That was around the time Frank had been working late every night. I thanked her, took the printout she offered, and walked out of that building like a woman sleepwalking. Driving home, the world looked strange. The houses I passed seemed to stare back at me, their windows glinting in the sun like judgment. The street signs blurred, and my hands gripped the steering wheel too tight. When I pulled into our driveway, the same gravel crackling under the tires, I looked at the house and felt foreign. Inside, Frank was in his recliner, half watching a game show. He looked up and smiled. "Hey, honey, what's for dinner?" I just stared at him. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I wanted to scream. "How long have you been lying to me?" But I didn't. Instead, I walked past him straight to the kitchen and started making spaghetti. Because that's what wives do when their world collapses in silence. That night, after he fell asleep, I went to my desk drawer and pulled out 20 years of mortgage receipts. Every canceled check, every letter from the bank neatly stacked and dated. I started reading them one by one, tracing the ink like fingerprints of my own devotion. That's when I noticed it. The last few payments weren't addressed to the same bank. They'd been redirected to a new P.O. box. The company name didn't sound familiar. Something about it looked like a shell account. I felt my stomach twist. The next morning, I took my coffee out to the porch and watched the sun rise over the old oak tree. For the first time, the house didn't feel like home. It felt like evidence. I thought of all the times Frank had said, "Don't worry about it, Maggie. I'll take care of you." And he did. He took care of me right out of my own house. I folded the deed copy, slipped it into my purse, and whispered to myself, "Paper trails never lie." That's when I knew whatever he'd done, I was going to uncover it. The next morning, the first thing I did was call the bank. I'd spoken to the same woman there for years, Patricia. She knew my voice before I even said my name. "Morning, Mrs. Collins," she said cheerfully. "All paid off now, right?" I hesitated. That's what I thought. There was a pause. "Is there a problem? I just need to check something?" I said, keeping my voice steady. "Who did the last payment post too?" I could hear the faint clicking of her keyboard. Then a long exhale. "It's showing as processed, but the routing changed. Looks like the account switched to a private escrow service 3 months ago. That's unusual, but it's not illegal. Do you have the name on the receiving account?" Patricia hesitated. "Mrs. Collins, that information might be confidential." "Please," I said softly. "Just tell me if it's under a name you recognize." Another pause. Then quietly, "Cheryl M. Collins." I thanked her, hung up, and sat there at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold. The name Cheryl felt like acid in my mouth. He didn't just betray me emotionally, he did it legally. I spent the next few days pretending everything was normal. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, smiled when Frank talked about the upcoming sales conference. But each night, after he fell asleep, I pulled out my old checkbook and files. That's when I found the blue check, the last payment I'd mailed. It was carbon copied on that thin blue paper I'd used for decades. I'd written it out carefully, like always. For mortgage principal, final payment. But instead of Bloomington National Bank, the payee line said, Midwest Escrow Management. I remembered that name now. Frank had told me once it was just a temporary intermediary. At the time, I'd believed him. Now, looking at the handwriting, something inside me shifted. I wasn't crying anymore. I wasn't even angry. I was focused. The next day, I drove to my friend Linda's house. Linda used to work at a bank before she retired, and she still had that no-nonsense Midwestern practicality that made people tell her things. She opened the door, saw my face, and said, "What's wrong?" "Do you still have access to that routing database?" I asked. She frowned. "Maggie, what are you up to? I just need to know where this check went." She sighed, led me to her small office, and booted up her computer. "All right, let's see it." I handed her the photo I'd taken of the blue check. She typed a few numbers, squinted, then froze. "This isn't a standard bank. It's a private escrow account registered to an individual." "Who?" She looked up slowly. "Cheryl M. Collins." I didn't say a word. I just sat back in the chair staring at the wall behind her. The wallpaper had little blue flowers like the ones I used to paint in our kitchen before Frank said it looked too old-fashioned. "Do you want me to print this?" Linda asked gently. "Yes," I said. "And can you date stamp it?" She did. I took the printout, folded it into my purse, and thanked her. When I left, she followed me to the door and said, "Maggie, don't do anything stupid." I smiled. "No, Linda. I'm going to do something smart." That evening, I cooked pot roast, Frank's favorite. I set the table like I always did. The house smelled warm, almost comforting. He came in, whistling, dropped his keys in the bowl, and kissed my cheek. "Something smells good." I poured him a glass of sweet tea and said, "Sit down, I want to show you something." He looked surprised. "You're in a good mood." "I am," I said. "I've been organizing our paperwork." I laid the photocopy of the check and the county printout on the table. His smile faltered. "What's this?" "You tell me," I said quietly. Whose name is on that escrow account? He stared at the papers for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. It's not what you think. Oh, it's exactly what I think I said. You put this house in her name. He started explaining something about refinancing tax benefits just on paper. But I'd stopped listening. I'd seen how his hands shook. I'd seen the fear crawl across his face when I mentioned the county clerk's office. I trusted you, I said. For 20 years I believed you. He rubbed his forehead. Maggie, please, it's complicated. I stood. No, Frank. It's criminal. He looked up sharply. What are you talking about? The deed transfer, the forgery, the escrow reroute. I talked to the bank, and the county clerk has copies of everything. You what? I'm not stupid, Frank. I said, my voice steady. You should have known better than to underestimate a bookkeeper. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. He just stared at me, mouth open, eyes darting toward the front door like he wanted to run. Later that night, I sat alone on the porch, watching the streetlights come on one by one. Inside the house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I took the photo of the blue check out of my purse and studied it again under the porch light. It wasn't just ink. It was proof the moment Truth wrote my name louder than his lies. I didn't know what would come next. Divorce court paperwork, it didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time in 2 decades, the house finally felt like mine. Not because of his signature, but because I'd found my own. Frank didn't come home the next night. I wasn't surprised. When you expose a liar, their first instinct isn't to apologize, it's to hide. I spent the evening sitting at the kitchen table staring at the pile of paperwork that had quietly unraveled my life. The house creaked with the kind of silence you can feel pressing against your chest. The next morning, his car was gone, his closet half empty. I found his toothbrush missing, but his cologne still sitting on the counter. That scent, sharp and artificial, lingered in the bathroom, like arrogance refusing to leave. By noon, I got a call from Linda. You all right? I'm fine. I lied. She hesitated. You sound like someone standing in the middle of a storm pretending it's just a breeze. I smiled faintly. Maybe it's time the storm hit. I drove to the county clerk's office that afternoon, wearing my navy cardigan and carrying a folder, thick with 20 years of proof. The woman behind the counter was new, her hair pulled into a neat bun, eyes kind but cautious. Her name tag read, Julie. How can I help you, ma'am? I need to file a property inquiry, I said. There's been a fraudulent title transfer. She blinked. That's serious. I know. I laid out the documents like cards in a poker game mortgage receipts, photocopies of the blue, checked the bank statement showing the escrow transfer. Julie scanned each page carefully. Then she looked up and said something that made my pulse quicken. Mrs. Collins? This isn't a clerical error. These are forged signatures. I exhaled slow and heavy. I thought so. Do you have proof of your payments? I slid a manila envelope across the counter. Every single one since 2003. She looked impressed. You kept all of these, every woman who's been lied to keeps receipts, I said. Julie nodded, almost smiling. She photocopied everything, stamped the paperwork, and handed me a yellow slip. This will open a case with the county recorder's fraud division. Someone will contact you within 10 business days. In the meantime, you can place a hold on the deed. That means no sale or transfer can happen until this is resolved. A hold. The word felt like breathing room. Do it, I said. I stopped for lunch at McDonald's on Walnut Street, the same one Frank and I used to go to after Sunday errands. The staff had changed, but the smell was the same salt grease and something comforting in its simplicity. I sat by the window, sipping a Diet Coke, thinking about how love can turn into paperwork faster than you ever imagine. When I got home, there was a voicemail waiting. Frank's voice. Calm. Too calm. Maggie, we need to talk. Don't make this bigger than it is. Bigger than it is. I laughed so hard I startled myself. That evening, I pulled into First Federal Credit Union, where a friend of mine, Tommy, worked as a loan officer. He'd known Frank for years. When I told him what happened, he shook his head slowly. I never liked the guy, he said. Always acted like money was a game he could rig. Can you check something for me? I asked. He typed a few things into his computer, then looked up. The house was refinanced 6 months ago. He pulled out equity, about 40 grand. I clenched my hands together. And where did it go? Tommy gave me a long look. Joint account with Cheryl. Not you. The air left my lungs. I'd worked overtime, skipped vacations, bought store-brand cereal for years, and he'd taken the house's equity to fund a new life with her. Tommy said softly, "You could press charges. Fraud, forgery, even identity theft. You've got the paper trail." "I already started," I said. 2 days later, I got a call from the county investigator, a woman named Detective Hargrove. Her tone was firm, but not unfriendly. "Mrs. Collins, I've reviewed your claim. You were right to file. There's enough evidence here for a formal case." I felt both relief and dread. "What happens now?" "We'll send notices to all parties involved. The property deed will be frozen. No sales, no refinancing, no transfers until the investigation closes. You'll need to be patient, but you've done the right thing." "Detective," I said quietly. "What are my chances?" She hesitated. In Indiana, paper trails carry a lot of weight. That night, I lit a candle on the kitchen counter and sat in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I thought about all the years I'd spent believing that being a good wife meant trusting without question. But now, sitting there alone, I realized trust without truth is just debt in disguise. A week later, the official county letter arrived. The case number was printed in bold. The opening line read, "Property title under dispute. Fraudulent transfer suspected." I read it twice then, 3 times. The words didn't fix the past, but they finally gave it shape. That evening, I took a walk down our street, Maple Avenue, lined with trees that were starting to shed their leaves. I passed the neighbors who used to wave when Frank mowed the lawn. Some nodded politely. Others pretended not to see me. Small towns remember everything, but I wasn't ashamed. Not anymore. As I walked back up the driveway, I looked at the porch light flickering above the door and whispered to myself, "You can't erase 20 years with a new signature." I stepped inside, closed the door, and felt the weight of something new, not loneliness, but liberation. The next morning, I woke to the sound of gravel crunching outside. For a split second, I thought Frank had come back. But when I looked through the window, it wasn't his car. It was a white sedan with county plates. 2 people stepped out, one in a gray suit, and the other holding a clipboard. I met them at the door. "Mrs. Collins," the woman asked. "I'm Detective Hargrove. This is Mr. Keaton from the recorder's office. We're here to go over the details of your case." Her tone was professional, but her eyes were kind. I invited them inside and poured coffee the way I always did for guests, even when those guests were here to document your husband's betrayal. We sat at the kitchen table, my same kitchen table, the one where I'd written every check for that mortgage. I slid the folder of evidence toward her, the blue check photocopy, the escrow routing info, the title transfer printout, and my 20 years of bank statements. Detective Hargrove flipped through each page carefully. "This is thorough," she said. "You kept good records." I gave a small smile. My mother used to say, "If you can't count on people, at least you can count on paper." Guess she was right. Mr. Keaton nodded. "Everything appears legitimate, Mrs. Collins." The signature transferring title to Cheryl Collins was filed electronically. That means someone used your husband's login credentials for the county system. It's pretty clear-cut fraud. Hargrove added, "We'll freeze the title immediately. You'll get official notice within 48 hours. I nodded, gripping my mug. "What happens to them?" "That depends," she said. "If your husband cooperates, this can be settled civilly. If not, we'll move forward criminally. You might be asked to testify." I looked at the framed wedding photo on the mantel, me in a simple cream dress, Frank grinning beside me. We looked like kids pretending we knew what love meant. "If it comes to that," I said, "I'll testify." After they left, I walked through the house slowly. Every corner carried the echo of a life I thought was real. The dent on the hallway wall where Frank once bumped a chair. The faded spot on the rug from the Christmas tree water leak. These weren't just flaws, they were memories proof that this house had been lived in, loved in, and now fought for. That evening, I called Linda. They froze the deed I told her. "Good," she said. "He's not going to like that." "I don't care what he likes anymore." She chuckled softly. That's the Maggie I remember. But later that night, when the laughter faded, I sat on the porch again, same wooden swing, same creaking chain, and wondered how many other women had discovered the truth of their marriage through a piece of paper. 3 days passed before Frank finally called. His voice was calm, practiced, but underneath it I could hear panic. "Maggie, we need to talk face to face. This is getting out of hand." "You mean the fraud investigation?" I asked. "Maggie, please." "You're overreacting. It's just a name on paper." "You know I'd never." "Frank," I cut him off, "don't insult me with another lie. They already traced the routing number. You moved our house into her name." He exhaled sharply. "It was a business decision. Cheryl helped me secure a better rate." I laughed, bitter and short. "You used my money, my payments, my credit score." "That's not a business decision, Frank. That's theft." His tone shifted colder now. "You're making a scene, Maggie. You want to ruin both our lives over a misunderstanding, no, Frank. You already did that." I hung up before he could reply. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the old clock in the hallway ticked like footsteps pacing my mind. I went to my desk and opened the drawer where I'd kept every financial document since 2003. On a whim, I dug deeper and found an unopened envelope, an old bank letter from 4 months ago. It was addressed to both of us. I slid it open carefully. Inside was a notice of equity disbursement, a record of a $42,000 withdrawal made from the home's value. My breath caught. $42,000. I flipped the page. The recipient name, Cheryl M. Collins. The account number matched the escrow line from my blue check. I sat there for a long time staring at that paper. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from fury. All those nights Frank had complained about being broke, all those times I'd made excuses for why we couldn't replace the washing machine he'd been sitting on, 40 grand. The next morning, I drove straight to Detective Hargrove's office. She listened quietly as I laid out the new evidence. When I showed her the equity letter, her expression hardened. "This changes things," she said. "This isn't just fraud, it's embezzlement." "What happens next?" "We'll need to bring him in for questioning. You may get a subpoena." I nodded. "Whatever it takes." That evening, I came home to find a white envelope taped to the door. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "Maggie, please don't do this. You're blowing everything out of proportion. I can fix it. Just stop talking to the police. Frank." There was a second sheet, a photocopy of a check made out to cash. The signature looked like his, but the handwriting was shaky. In the memo line, he'd written, "For Maggie. Final settlement. The amount $1." I sat down on the porch steps and laughed until tears blurred my vision. It was so absurd, so cruel, that it looped back around to comedy. He'd left me a single dollar for 20 years of my life. I folded the note, put it in an envelope marked "Evidence," and whispered to the quiet street. "You can't buy me off with $1, Frank. Not anymore." Inside, I poured myself a cup of coffee, stared out the window at the golden Indiana sunset, and felt something shift deep inside. For the first time, I wasn't just the woman who got cheated, I was the woman who knew how to fight back. The county hearing was set for the following Wednesday. I arrived early, dressed in my gray cardigan and dark slacks, the same clothes I wore to church on Sundays. The courthouse in Bloomington wasn't grand, just an old brick building with worn floors that smelled faintly of dust and coffee. But that morning, it felt like the stage of my entire life. I sat in the hallway outside the small claims chamber, holding a folder pressed to my chest. Inside were copies of everything: the blue check, the bank statements, the notarized receipts, the fraud report, even Frank's ridiculous $1 note. Linda came with me. She'd insisted. "You're not walking into that room alone," she said, looping her arm through mine. "You've done enough of that already." When they called my name, my legs felt like lead. Frank was already seated at the table, a cheap suit hanging awkwardly off his shoulders. Cheryl sat beside him, blonde, perfectly manicured, pretending to be calm, but biting the inside of her cheek. She looked like she hadn't slept, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if guilt ever keeps her up at night. The hearing officer, an older man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, glanced between us. "Mrs. Collins, you're the complainant. You may begin." I opened my folder, my voice steady, but my heart pounding. "For 20 years, I paid the mortgage on our house at 412 Maple Avenue. My husband, Frank Collins, and I bought it together in 2003. Every payment came from my account. I have documentation of all transactions. 3 months before the mortgage was paid off, my husband refinanced the home without my knowledge, transferring the title into the name of another woman, Cheryl Collins, using my money, my credit, and my trust." The officer nodded. "Do you have evidence of this transfer?" "Yes, sir." I handed over the deed printout, the bank letter and the blue check copy. Frank shifted in his chair, jaw tight. Cheryl kept her eyes fixed on the table. The officer studied the documents for a long moment, then looked up. "Mr. Collins, would you like to respond?" Frank cleared his throat. "This was a misunderstanding," he said, trying to sound composed. "The refinancing was for tax purposes. Cheryl simply co-signed to help me qualify." The officer turned to me. "Mrs. Collins, were you made aware of this arrangement at the time?" "No, sir. I only found out when the county office told me I wasn't listed on the deed." Frank started again. "It wasn't meant to hurt anyone." I interrupted him. "Then why was the escrow account in Cheryl's name? Why did the final mortgage payment go to her personal account?" He froze. The room went quiet, except for the faint buzz of the fluorescent light above us. I pulled out the photocopy of the blue check and slid it across the table. "That's my handwriting, my ink, my money. The endorsement stamp belongs to Cheryl M. Collins. That's fraud." The officer adjusted his glasses. "It appears so, Frank leaned back, trying to regain control. Look, Maggie, we can settle this privately. There's no reason to drag this through. I cut him off again, firmer now. You dragged it when you forged my future. Cheryl finally spoke, her voice small. Frank told me the house was his. I turned to her eyes, steady. It was ours. He just forgot the part where one of us was paying for it. After the hearing, Hargrove met me in the hallway. You did well, she said. We'll follow up with the state attorney. He's facing multiple counts of fraud and document falsification. The property title will remain frozen until the court decides ownership. Given your documentation, that shouldn't take long. I nodded, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Thank you. As I walked out of the courthouse, the Indiana sun hit my face bright and clear, like the first real light after a storm. For years, I'd been dimming myself so Frank could shine. That day, I stopped doing that. That evening, I went home and poured myself a glass of iced tea. The porch light flickered on automatically, just like it always had. I sat on the swing watching the neighbors across the street. Mrs. Henderson waved. She'd heard the gossip, of course, but her smile was kind. When the mail truck stopped by, the driver handed me a certified envelope. The sender, Monroe County Recorder. I opened it right there on the porch. It was official. The property deed had been returned to Margaret Collins, sole owner. The tears came fast this time, hot and silent. 20 years of work. 20 years of love, disappointment, and quiet endurance, all written back under my name. Later that night, the phone rang again. I didn't answer at first, but curiosity got the better of me. Hello, Frank's voice was thin, tired. They froze my accounts. Cheryl's gone. I just wanted to say, I waited. You win. I took a breath. It wasn't about winning Frank. It was about telling the truth. He hung up without another word. I stood there in the kitchen, phone still in my hand, staring out at the house I'd fought for. Every corner of it suddenly looked different, not as a place of betrayal, but as proof of resilience. I turned off the lights and whispered to the darkness. Paper trails never lie. A week later, Detective Hargrove called to confirm the case was closed. Frank had signed a settlement admitting to the falsified paperwork. The court restored full ownership to me and required him to pay restitution. It wasn't much, but that wasn't the point. The point was, I got my name back. The news of the hearing spread through Bloomington faster than summer gossip at a church potluck. People didn't mean to be cruel, they just loved a story. And mine had all the right ingredients: betrayal money, a woman who refused to stay quiet. At the grocery store, Mrs. Benson from down the street whispered, "Good for you, Maggie." About time someone taught that man a lesson. At church, the pastor shook my hand a little longer than usual. Sometimes truth needs to be told out loud, he said. And at the post office, I overheard someone murmur, "She got the house back." Each time I smiled politely. I didn't need pity or applause. What I wanted was peace. I started cleaning the house from top to bottom the way you do when you're trying to reclaim more than just square footage. Every corner I scrubbed felt like I was erasing fingerprints, his fingerprints. The closet no longer smelled of his cologne. The nightstand no longer held his half-read newspapers. I even rearranged the furniture, moved the recliner he loved to the curb, and put my grandmother's rocker in its place. That's when I noticed something odd behind the old TV cabinet, a small metal box with a lock. It was dented and dusty, hidden like a secret he thought would never see daylight. I sat on the floor with a screwdriver, pried it open, and inside were stacks of old receipts, a few business cards, and one thick envelope labeled "Insurance Claim, Cheryl M. Collins." I froze. Inside was a life insurance policy Frank had taken out the year before for $150,000, with Cheryl listed as the beneficiary. Not me. Not the wife who'd shared his bed and bills for 2 decades. Her. I don't remember how long I sat there staring at it, but when I stood up, I wasn't shaking anymore. The fear had burned itself out, leaving something sharper behind clarity. The next morning, I went to see Tommy at the bank again. He whistled low when he saw the paperwork. "You've got him nailed 6 ways to Sunday," he said. "I'm not trying to destroy him," I said. "I just want everything that's mine." Tommy nodded. "You'll get it. The law's on your side now." That phrase, "the law's on your side," felt like a foreign comfort. I'd spent my life believing in people more than paperwork, in promises, more than protection. Now the opposite was true. The law didn't forget, didn't twist its words in the dark. As I left, Tommy added, "He won't recover from this, you know." I paused by the door. Neither will I. But at least I'll heal in the house I paid for. A week later, an envelope arrived from Frank's lawyer, a proposed settlement. It offered to transfer the remaining funds from his retirement account to me, along with written acknowledgement of misconduct. But there was a condition: I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement and refrain from discussing the matter publicly. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and slipped it into my shredder. If a man wants forgiveness, he doesn't get to buy it by silencing the truth. That night, I got another call, this time from Cheryl. Her voice trembled. "Margaret." "I didn't know he was still married," she said quickly, as if confessing to a priest. "He told me you two were separated. He said you didn't care about the house." I took a slow breath. "You believed him because it was easier than asking questions." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm not the one you need to apologize to," I said. "You should look in the mirror for that." There was silence on the line, then a soft sob before she hung up. For a moment, I felt pity. Not for her, but for every woman who believed the same kind of man twice. The county finalized my ownership a month later. The property taxes were in my name again. The restitution check cleared. It wasn't much, just enough to replace the leaking roof and maybe repaint the porch, but it felt symbolic. I hired a local contractor named Ray, a quiet man in his 60s, who worked slow and steady. One afternoon, while he fixed the gutters, he looked down from the ladder and said, "You're a strong woman, Mrs. Collins. Most folks would have just walked away." I smiled up at him. I walked away once years ago from my own courage. I don't plan to do that again. He nodded. Good answer. That evening, when the work was done, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and honeysuckle. The sun was setting low, casting a warm amber light across the yard. I could hear kids playing down the street, dogs barking, life moving on, as it always does in small towns like ours. I thought about the blue check, the one piece of paper that had flipped my world upside down and right side up again. Proof justice closure, all written in blue ink. The world might forget what he did. The neighbors might stop talking. But I'd never forget how the truth looked printed beside my own name. And I realized something. That night revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just signs its name quietly and waits for the sun to set. A few days later, I visited the county courthouse again, not for paperwork this time, but to thank Detective Hargrove. She met me in the hallway, smiling. So she said, "Does it feel over?" I thought for a moment. "No," I said, "but it feels like it's mine." She nodded, shaking my hand firmly. "You did more than most people ever would. You saw it through." Maybe, I said softly. Or maybe I just wanted my name to mean something again. That night, I came home and turned on the porch light. The roses I'd planted last spring were blooming under the glow the air thick with their scent. I leaned against the railing and let out a long breath. The house was quiet, the good kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't hide, lies in its walls. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt safe inside my own story. The summer sun settled low over Bloomington, stretching long shadows across the porch I'd fought so hard to keep. The roses I planted were in full bloom, red and defiant, just like I felt inside. The legal papers were framed, now hanging in my living room, above the mantel, deed, title, Margaret Collins, sole owner. Sometimes when I passed it, I'd run my fingers along the edge of the frame, not out of vanity, but gratitude. That paper wasn't just a property record. It was my proof that truth, slow, stubborn truth, always finds its way to daylight. The first few weeks after the settlement were strangely quiet. The phone didn't ring. The mailbox stopped bringing bad news. I'd expected to feel empty, but instead, I felt light. I went back to work part-time at the local accounting office, where people whispered my name with a kind of quiet respect. "That's her," someone murmured once in the hallway. "The woman who caught her husband's fraud." I just smiled and kept walking. Let them talk. Maybe my story would remind someone else to check their paperwork, to believe the math, not the man. On Fridays, Linda would stop by with pie, and we'd sit on the porch, sharing stories. She called it our victory tea. "You know, Maggie," she said one evening, "you could have walked away, sold the house, started fresh." I looked out at the yard, golden under the Indiana dusk. "I didn't fight for the wood or the walls," I said. "I fought for my name." She nodded slowly. That's the kind of story that lasts. A month later, I got a letter from Cheryl. Handwritten, shaky, like someone trying to stitch a wound that never quite healed. "Dear Margaret, I wanted to say thank you. You don't know it, but you saved me too. I left Frank. I found out he'd taken loans in my name, 2 small ones, but still lies. I sold my car, paid them off, and moved back to Terre Haute. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I learned. Paper trails don't lie. Cheryl." I read it twice, then folded it and slipped it into the same desk drawer where I'd once kept that cursed blue check. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like understanding. Life has a strange way of handing out lessons, sometimes justice, sometimes mercy, and sometimes both in the same envelope. That fall, I decided to repaint the house, not because it needed it, but because I did. I chose a soft cream color, the shade my mother used to call hopeful white. Ray, my contractor friend, offered to help, but I wanted to do this one myself. Each brushstroke felt like a promise I'm still here. I survived it. I own every inch of this. Neighbors waved as they passed. Some offered help. Most just smiled. In small towns, people understand the meaning of standing your ground, even if they don't say it out loud. One morning, while I was painting the porch rail, a little girl from next door wandered over, holding a lemonade. "My mom says you're really brave," she said matter-of-factly. I smiled down at her. "Your mom's sweet." She shrugged. "She said you caught a bad man." I laughed softly. "Something like that." She thought for a moment, then said, "My grandma says truth always wins, even if it's slow." Out of the mouths of children. I handed her the empty brush. "Then maybe you should help me finish painting." Winter came early that year. The cold mornings smelled of wood smoke and frost. But inside, the house was warm. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. Each night, I wrote small truths, reminders of who I was before and who I'd become after. One entry read, "Revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting whole again." Another said, Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means refusing to carry someone else's lie any longer. I wrote those lines because I wanted them to outlive me, to stay in this house, in these walls, long after I was gone. One Sunday morning, months later, I was having coffee on the porch when a for sale sign went up across the street. New family moving in. Young couple with a baby. The husband waved as they unloaded boxes. I waved back, smiling. For the first time in years, I didn't feel envy or bitterness. I just hoped they'd learn what I did, that a home isn't made of siding and nails. It's made of honesty, and that kind of foundation doesn't crack easily. That evening, I lit a candle in the window, a quiet ritual I'd started after the case closed. It wasn't for Frank or for Cheryl or even for the past. It was for the woman I used to be, the one who thought silence was love and obedience was peace. Now, when I look at the flickering light, I remind myself, silence hides lies, but truth, no matter how small, always burns steady. Before going to bed, I sat at my desk one last time. I took out the blue check framed now in a small glass box and placed it beside my reading lamp. Beneath it, I'd written in simple black ink, "Paper trails never lie." Then I added one more line just for myself, "and neither do women who keep them." I smiled, turned off the light, and let the soft hum of the Indiana night fill the room. Some stories don't end with fireworks. Some end with peace and a porch light that stays on for whoever still believes in the truth. So if you're listening and this story sounds like yours, remember, keep your records, keep your courage, and never let anyone sign your name out of your own life. Because justice isn't just found in courtrooms. Sometimes it's found on paper and in women who finally decide to tell their story.